Please come to order. Ladies and gentlemen, the default parliamentary situation would be that we would continue consideration of all amendments related to the charter school provision of this bill before continuing with consideration of the amendment offered by the gentleman from the 30th, Delegate Bates. However, there are a number of those amendments still pending, and given the posture of the House on previous amendments, the chair would ask unanimous consent that the body suspend the rules and permit consideration of the amendment offered by the gentleman from the 30th, which, if adopted, would preclude consideration of at least 3 subsequent amendments. Does the chair hear objection? Chair hears no objection. House will return to consideration now of the amendment offered by the gentleman from the 30th, Delegate Bates.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We kind of took a little detour there for an hour or so, and here's your opportunity to keep the train on the rails. So we can end this now. We can end this now. Clearly, there are people in here that feel very passionate about this issue of charter schools, but I would suggest that they are in the minority, and back home, they're clearly in the minority, and they are certainly in the minority of the people that were up in our galleries earlier and they're out in our steps earlier. So if anyone believes that the bill that leaves this House will be the bill that will return in the same form from the Senate or not, or be agreeable to the Senate, then you're kind of kidding yourselves. So my amendment simply takes out the section that deals with charter schools, ends the debate and the discussion on that particular topic, and I think for most people puts the bill in a form that they could potentially support. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question before the House is the adoption of the amendment by the gentleman from the 30th. Are the members who wish to speak to the adoption of the amendment? The gentleman from the 58th, Delegate Coles.
Would the gentleman yield, Mr. Speaker?
Gentleman does yield.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I didn't quite follow the exact point you were making at the end. If this amendment were to pass, you would vote for the bill?
I would certainly be much more inclined to do so. I believe there's other amendments pending in the system.
Still undecided even with this amendment?
I continue to have my concerns, but it certainly increases the likelihood of me voting, and I believe that would be the case for some other members, and I think it would also, should it return from the Senate in the same form, increases the likelihood of me voting for the bill in its entirety. I would like to vote for the bill. There are elements of this bill that I don't necessarily disagree with, and I think there are some good things in here, and if there's enough good things in there, then I think that improves the odds of passage of the bill. I believe that charter schools in this bill puts the bill in jeopardy.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to speak just briefly.
Gentleman may continue.
Mr. Speaker, I believe this is just another strike at the indignation to parents and parental involvement that bothers me, including the 2 charter schools in the very limited fashion, certainly does not and should not harm the bill. But I have concerns over the harm we're doing to the inclusion of parents into the system, and I would urge rejection of the amendment. Thank you.
Are there other members who wish to speak to the adoption of the amendment? The gentleman from the 62nd, Delegate Bibby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I spoke earlier. I'm willing to stay here all night till we go through amendment by amendment. The gentleman that offered the amendment said he couldn't vote for a bill, or wasn't sure if he could vote for a bill. I would suggest that we continue through the normal deliberative process and we continue with the amendments as a normal order. Thank you.
Are there other members who wish to speak to the adoption of the amendment? Does the gentleman from the 30th wish to close debate?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, this is your opportunity to end this discussion now. We'll be having it again when this bill comes back to us. Let's move on. And I ask for the ayes and the nays. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The question before the House is the adoption of the amendment. The roll call has been demanded. Is the demand sustained? Demand is sustained. The question before the House is the adoption of the amendment by the gentleman from the 30th. Those in favor will vote aye. Those opposed will vote no. The clerk will prepare the machine. Has every member voted? Has every member voted? If so, the clerk will close the machine and ascertain the result. On this question, there are 45 yeas, 49 nays, less than a majority having voted in the affirmative. Chair declares the amendment rejected. Clerk will present the next amendment that would have been considered in regular order.
Delegates Walker, S. Brown, C. Thompson, Hornbuckle, Bates, Lavender Bow, Barrett, Eastep Burton, Pethel, and Miley move to amend the amendment. This is HFA Walker, S. Brown, et al., 213.
The question before the House is the adoption of the amendment. Would a sponsor wish to present the amendment? The lady from 65th, Doggett Brown.
Yes, sir, Mr. Speaker, thank you. In this particular amendment, we are looking to interject inclusivity. We are making sure that if we are going to have charter schools in this bill, and it seems to be the will of this body to do so, wrong amendment.
Lady may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The intent of this amendment is to interject inclusivity into the clause. If we are going to pursue charter schools, if we are truly going to go after making sure that all students are represented, and because there is an application process, a stringent application process, as mentioned before in this body, then we want to make sure that absolutely no student is discriminated against. And therefore, we are moving to make sure that the LGBTQ community is absolutely represented and they cannot be discriminated against in this application process. I've heard repeatedly about how we have students voting with their footsteps, that we have a student that is leaving, and I actually am in that age demographic. I am in my 30s. I was born and raised here. I was in the public school system. I stayed here, and now I sit with you in this body as a representative that includes my hometown. And so I say, not only for my hometown, but the people of West Virginia and the teachers that are still with us in the gallery, that we are looking to represent each and every student in the state of West Virginia. And because prior, we decided that we did not want to pursue non-discrimination ordinances, so we will make sure that we will do it in every single bill that we pass here. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, I will move and urge passage to include inclusivity, to include non-discrimination, and move forward with real progress in the state of West Virginia. Thank you.
Are there members? The question before the House is the adoption of the amendment. Are there members who wish to speak to the adoption of the amendment? The gentleman from 32nd, Doggett Fast.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to this amendment. First of all, this amendment only applies to charter schools. We're talking about an omnibus education bill ultimately here. So this only applies to charter schools. So that's exclusive in and of itself. Secondly, sexual orientation is not defined in this amendment. Last I checked, there were more than 200 identified sexual orientations. Third, gender identity. It says that shall not discriminate based on sexual orientation or gender identity. Shall not discriminate. Now, that would necessarily mean that if a male person, and I'll just be blunt, with male body parts, wishes to identify as a female, and then the school where children are, where our young people are, decides to identify as a female and wants to go into the female's restroom, that school cannot discriminate and tell that male he can't go in there. That also would lead to the same scenario with locker rooms. It would lead to the same scenario with shower rooms, where girls may be showering after gym class. It would lead to the same scenario where males who identify as a female wish to participate against females in female sports. This would lead, ladies and gentlemen, to failure of protection for weaker people. It would lead to failure of protection for anyone who may be in a restroom or a locker room that may be overpowered by someone who chooses to identify as an opposite sex. I mean, these are the realities of what we're doing with. So it only applies to a small segment. Orientation is completely undefined, and I just described what could happen with the gender identity. Now, this is not hatred. It's not hatred, it's reality. And so I would ask, ladies and gentlemen, that this amendment be rejected.
Gentleman from 37, Douglas Pushkin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to point something out for some of the members who are new to this body. You and I, Mr. Speaker, actually had the good fortune of coming here in the same year. I'd say you have definitely fared a little better than I have since we've been here, but and that's to your credit. But that year, 2015, when we both were sworn in and served in this body, there was a charter school bill that year. I remember this well because I served on the Education Committee that year, and that charter school bill had this language in it, that charter schools could not discriminate, and it named several protected classes, and it named one that unfortunately two that unfortunately in West Virginia we have not added to our Human Rights Act. But that bill that we had in 2015 named sexual orientation and gender identity as protected classes that could not be discriminated against in the enrollment process and recruitment process for charter schools. So I'd say if it was good enough for the bill, as it came here from whatever entity it was at the time that y'all were getting your charter school bills from, it was in there then because it applied to most states that have already had the good foresight to include folks with different sexual orientation of gender identity in their Human Rights Act, saying, well, it's good enough for us now. And the reason why we need language like that, from what we just heard from my good friend from the 32nd, that's why we need language like that in there.
The gentleman from the 62nd, Douglas Bibby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to this amendment, not for what you would think. I look at it and it's very exclusive and really unnecessary. We already have those protections in our Constitution. In fact, the 5th and 14th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution limit the power of the federal and state government to discriminate. The Fifth Amendment has an explicit requirement that the federal government not deprive individuals of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. It also contains an implicit guarantee that each person receives equal protection of the law. The 14th Amendment explicitly prohibits states from violating an individual's rights due to due process and equal protection. Moreover, the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution guarantees freedoms concerning religion, expression, assembly, and petition, and forbids the government from promoting one religion over others and also restricting an individual's religious practices. It also guarantees freedom of expression by prohibiting the government from restricting the rights of individuals to speak freely. Moreover, the West Virginia Constitution affirms the U.S. Constitution, and the laws and treaties made in pursuance thereof shall be the supreme law of the land. I would suggest, ladies and gentlemen, that this amendment is exclusive and discriminatory in its face, and that we not support this amendment. Instead, we support the Constitution of the United States and the amendments thereof, and the West Virginia Constitution. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from 67, Douglas Doyle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We should pass this amendment. We should adopt this amendment. Sorry, adopt it. I believe the gentleman from the 62nd, I'm sorry, is incorrect when he says that this is already law. There are a number of states that have laws that ban discrimination against types of people who are regularly discriminated against. We have one that bans discrimination on the basis of race, of religion, of gender, and I think there are a couple of other things in there. But the two types of people who are described in this amendment are not included in that anti-discrimination amendment. There is, in fact, a bill here in the House, which has been languishing low these many years, which would correct that problem. Now, the gentleman from Fayette says that the problem points out that this only applies to charter schools. He's right. It doesn't go far enough, but it goes as far as it can possibly go in a bill like this. So I say we go as far as we can in this bill, and then someday soon, go the rest of the way. Let's adopt this amendment.
Gentleman 27, Doug Schott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to add just a different wrinkle to the argument. It appears to me that the amendment is redundant, and let me explain why. The language that it seeks to amend is on page 24 of the Strike and Insert Amendment. If you begin with line 9, it says, "A public charter school authorized under this article shall," and then number 1, "adhere to the same immunization, civil rights, and disability rights requirements applicable to non-charter public schools." Key phrase being civil rights. In West Virginia, our public schools cannot turn away any child. They're all entitled to be admitted. So children who have sexual orientation differences than the so-called normal child or have gender identity issues cannot be turned away from a public school. And under the provisions, clear provisions of this language of the Strike and Insert Amendment, they could not be turned away, and that's discriminated against in a charter school. So what we're doing is basically adding a redundant clause that's not necessary based on the clear language of the statute, of the Strike and Insert Amendment. Therefore, I think we should reject the amendment as being redundant.
The gentleman from 36, Doug Rowe.
Would the gentleman yield for a question, Mr. Chairman?
Sir.
Where could you identify where the protection for children and young people who have sexual orientation that may be different or gender identity that may be different?
To the gentleman, I
they're
stand by
protected?
my statement that no child can be turned away from public schools in West Virginia. If you are aware of a child who's been denied admission to a public school in West Virginia on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity, I would like to know about it because I've not heard of any.
Well, I'm just wondering if you can identify any place where these rights of these folks are guaranteed, whether it be in schools or in employment or in housing. Is there anything that says in West Virginia that you cannot discriminate on that basis? I don't know what it is.
To the gentleman, we're talking about public education. There have been a series of decisions by our state Supreme Court that every child in this state is entitled to a free and equal public education. There are no exceptions to that. This is the bill addresses education, not housing, education, and the clear language of this strike and insert is that the same provisions that protect students in being admitted to public schools would have to apply to charter schools.
But it doesn't just apply to admission, it applies to everything the charter school does. They can't pick these children out and put them aside or out of school. You know, we were told by the chair of Labor and Industry that we were, in fact, going to be having all sorts of difficult issues presented in locker rooms and bathrooms and that sort of thing. You know, there's no place. To be redundant, don't you have to have something that it's redundant to?
To the gentleman, nowhere in the public school system are children separated and treated differently based on gender identity or sexual preference. Those are the same civil rights that are going to be applied to charter schools based on the clear language of this statute.
But is that pure accident and coincidence and maybe good faith on people's part? Is there any place in a statute that says that those rights are to be protected?
And I'll repeat what I said earlier, a long line of cases from our state Supreme Court that says every child is entitled to a full, free education, public education.
Well, of course, they say that in broad terms, but is there anything that protects children on their identity and who they are? High school students, you know, in terms of who goes to the prom with them? Is there anything that says that? I mean, it's one thing to say that the Supreme Court continually says you got to treat children the same. We get that, and we should. But then there's the question of the day-to-day.
That's the law of the land, sir.
Well, but that doesn't translate all the way down. We've heard discussions about the Constitution and the 14th Amendment and the 13th Amendment and you know, due process of law. But the Supreme Court, you know, whenever that we passed public accommodation laws during the Jim Crow era, the Supreme Court said, no, that doesn't apply. It only applies to the state. And so the states proceeded to do something different. Well, you know, we've you know, had this issue presented. We had a question about there's no definition of sexual orientation or gender identity. That's in the bill that's locked up in Labor and Industry at this time. But to say that it's redundant, I think you have to have something you can point to show that it is redundant.
Civil rights. The term civil rights in there has been expanded, it's been explained and set forth repeatedly in our decisions of our court. It's in our Constitution that we're all entitled to the equal protection of the law. I don't know what else I can say. It doesn't delineate just because you wear a certain clothes, you can't be discriminated. Just because you're a certain height, it says everybody's to be treated the same. I don't know how it could be any clearer.
So I can understand, Mr. Chairman, what you're saying is civil rights means whatever we want to think that it might, that it includes everybody being treated the same. But the law actually is that discrimination and particularization is allowed, except for very defined reasons: race, ethnicity, religion, gender. Those discriminations are not allowed, but there's nothing in West Virginia law that says it's illegal to discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. And whenever you say that it's redundant, I just would, again, ask you to tell us where we could find any provision that allows or that outlaws that particular discrimination.
And I just have to repeat myself. In the public education system, every child is entitled to admission into school and be treated the same. This statute clearly says that the public schools, whatever civil rights are entitled to students in the public schools, will have to be entitled to those same students in charter schools. It couldn't be any clearer than that to me. Now, maybe you having trouble with that,
Well,
but it couldn't be any clearer than that
I am
to me.
having trouble because to be redundant, there needs to be a statute, and I don't know, I can't figure out where that would be.
Gentleman, the 14th has a point of order.
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Okay, gentleman may state his
I
point.
think the gentleman has answered the question several times, and I understand it may not be satisfactory, but I don't know how else he could state it. He's answered it several times.
If the gentleman's willing to continue engaging in debate, he has the right to yield the floor.
We hit my head against the wall so many times, Mr. Speaker, I think I'm done.
Gentleman no longer yields. The delegate may continue if gentleman has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just again, to claim a redundancy here, I just don't know how we can do that. There has to be a redundancy to something. There is absolutely nothing in our statutes that say at all that these protections cannot be discriminated against. Sexual orientation and gender identity. There's nothing there. And to say that it's redundant is just an amazement to me. I think that clearly this is an appropriate amendment to put in to make sure that these schools can comply and not discriminate against these folks. Now, it was pointed out that this just applies to charter schools. Well, I have a feeling that if this had been broadly put, that it would not be germane to the bill relating to charter schools. So in order to make the amendment appropriate to the provisions that we have before us, it does apply to charter schools. It ought to apply to all schools, but it doesn't, because we're not considering all schools in this bill, despite how wide it is. The issues that are being presented are in a bill that's in the Labor and Industry Committee and has not been acted on. There was a question about the definition of those terms, sexual orientation and gender identity. That's in that bill. Now, it hasn't been included in this amendment because it's probably not necessary, because I think it's a fairly well, both are fairly well-known terms at this time. So, Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the indulgence, and I do urge the members to vote in favor of this amendment.
Gentleman from the 58th, Delegate Coles.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to the amendment as well. And in reading the language in the original amendment, as the chairman of Judiciary just did, it enumerated that it must adhere to the same civil rights, immunizations, disability rights as applicable non-charter schools, which suggested to me I should look up and see what the non-discrimination policy is for the schools in my area. And it says in their non-discrimination policy, in addition to civil rights, it enumerates the list that you are probably familiar with. The Board of Education by policy hereby affirms that it provides equal opportunity for all students and employees, regardless of race, color, sex, national origin, religion, handicap, age, marital status, political affiliation, or belief. When I turn to the actual text of the amendment, it seems to add at the end of a sentence, which already included the same as the non-public school and already included the term civil rights, a comma, and then, and shall not discriminate based on sexual orientation or gender identity. That does indeed seem to me to be redundant, as the list earlier was entirely inclusive. I think, too, the issue of gender identity seems to me to be covered by the issue of sex, which was listed in the earlier list. Sexual orientation may also be included in that definition, but sex is included in non-discrimination, and gender identity is clearly included in the non-discrimination. I think it would be redundant to add this language. I think it's included. West Virginia has a strong non-discrimination policy, and I'll support it evenly amongst charter and non-charter schools and oppose the amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from the 27th, Delegate Ellington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the lady from the 65th yield for a question?
Lady does yield.
All right, thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the lady, to you and the lady. My question concerns with the original bill, it says open enrollment. So if a county wanted to start a charter school or two charter schools, it'd be open enrollment, which to me would mean anyone in the county would be eligible, and that would not be discriminatory in my part. Would you agree?
I would agree with that.
Okay. And, you know, regarding things like sexual orientation or gender identity, I mean, I wouldn't want to discriminate against anything, much less that. I personally don't like the idea of labeling groups because I think that's kind of a form of discrimination. But aside from that, my concern is in different countries, other countries, earlier times in our country, and even probably private schools, maybe nowadays, I don't know how many, but they used to see that maybe children that were in an all-gender type of school, like all-girls school or all-boys school, may do well in a younger age, learn better. If a county wanted to start an all-girl or an all-boys school at those earlier ages, would your amendment preclude that possibility?
I don't believe so, sir. It doesn't seem like it would. Really what this is trying to do is make sure that within the current structure, although, let me grab counsel, within the current structure that that the bill is putting forth, is that we're making sure that no sort of discrimination, not only in enrollment, but also in the practice of school. So the other, furthermore, when we've talked about non-discrimination and when we've talked about the language, we've identified sex or gender, but not necessarily about identification. And it's shown that there is bias and there may be discrimination if, in fact, one identifies as something that they are not outwardly seen as.
And I understand that. I guess my concern would be, let's say a county wanted to do that and have two schools, one that had classes with all girls at an early age, one with all boys. But then I could see that maybe individuals may say, well, I'm identifying with, I'm a male this week, but I want to go into, that's the concern I might have as far as how would that affect the makeup of those two schools then?
So in the language, we're really discussing orientation and gender identity. The issue that I have with the statement that you made, even though I understand where you're coming from.
I'm just looking at the possibilities.
But
I'm not
even
looking
with the statement, that's implicit bias, sir. I mean, right there, saying that someone identifies as a gender one week and not another.
Well,
is
maybe
very
year
much,
by year they may change.
But that's not how this works.
Okay.
That's not at all how this works. And so why we're implementing this language is because of beliefs and belief structures like that. I want to be very clear about this, because the fact that maybe that's not how you identify, or maybe that's not how you understand this, doesn't negate the fact that there are folks that identify a certain way, that this is how they identify, this is their orientation. It is very real that this is the culture in not only our state, but across the nation. And so we need to make sure that our language, as a part of the bill, is up to par with making sure that we're inclusive in this language. Otherwise, it's antiquated. We need to understand that just because that's not how you or I identify, maybe that's not our lifestyle, doesn't negate the fact that it's not real, it's not actualized, and we shouldn't protect those people.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman with 66, Douglas Espinoza.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the House Judiciary Chair yield to a question?
Chairman does yield.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm on page 41 of the Finance Strike and Insert. And I'm looking under 18.5G11, prohibitions.
41, is that right?
Yes, that's what I have.
Give me just a second to
Sure.
scroll down to that. Okay, I'm there now.
So under prohibitions, this is how I read this. Notwithstanding any provision in this article that may be interpreted to the contrary, a public charter school may not, and then item 2 there, discriminate on any basis for which the non-charter public schools of this state may not discriminate.
I see that, yes.
Now my plain reading of that, and I certainly would appreciate your perspective, my plain reading is that public charter schools must comply with the same non-discrimination that our other traditional public schools comply with. Is that a fair reading of that?
That seems to be the clear intent of that statement, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman with 37, Douglas Pushkin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to point out the gentleman from Morgan read a list. I mean, this goes to address the point that was just made from the gentleman from the 66, who said that charter schools must follow the same non-discrimination policies as public schools. However, the gentleman sitting next to him from the 58th read the non-discrimination policy from the public schools in his district, which I imagine are fairly similar to in most counties, and what was left off of that list was sexual orientation. It's not on there because in West Virginia, we don't recognize sexual orientation as a protected class. I believe the authors, the sponsors of this amendment are trying to correct that because they think it's wrong. A lot of us think it's wrong. They think that people shouldn't be discriminated against because of their sexual orientation. And I applaud the sponsor of this amendment for trying to correct something that they feel is wrong and is something that is missing in our state code. Now, and when you read the bill, I believe this should apply to charter schools because their application process lends itself to a discriminatory process just in general. I mean, once the enrollment hits a certain level of the children who live in that area, there's a selection process. That in itself it's discriminatory, right? Not in the bad sense of the word, but they have to choose who gets to go to the school outside the district. So it would be important to put this type of language in here to make sure that everybody gets a fair chance at it and to correct a problem that we see here in our code in West Virginia, and that people with that sexual orientation is not a protected class. So I would thank the sponsors of this amendment for offering it, and I urge a green vote.
Ladies from the 51st, Elgin Walker, to close debate on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Redundant. We have heard in these chambers choice and freedom. I don't call that redundant. Choice and freedom. The delegate from the 14th said that kids are not boxes. Choice or freedom. The delegate from the 60th said, always leave the stakeholders out, the parents, the teachers, most importantly, the students. So why are some parents left out? Redundant, choice, and freedom. The delegate from the 62nd had one simple question. What is the problem? Redundant, choice, and freedom. We haven't even tried it. You'll go back 80 years. We only have fear, but fear itself. Wise words from FDR. Redundant, choice, and freedom. People are watching. Redundant. People are watching. Redundant, choice, and freedom. The delegate from the 48th, gangs, homeless kids, pregnant kids, oaths, U.S. Constitution, Bill of Rights, freedom of choice, ability to have freedom. Consider voting for freedom. Redundant, choice, and freedom. The delegate from the 62nd, they will have their voice tonight. They. Who is this they that we speak of? Everyone. All mountaineers, where everyone is included, no one is excluded. They will have their voice tonight. We may not win tonight, but we will win eventually. What's the fear? If you vote no, this is backwards thinking. This is hatred if you vote no. That is the reality. Redundant, choice, and freedom. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The question before the House is the adoption of the amendment. Roll call has been demanded. Is demand sustained? Demand is sustained. The question before the House is the adoption of the amendment. Those in favor will vote aye. Those opposed will vote no. The clerk will prepare the machine. Has every member voted? If so, the clerk will close the machine and ascertain the result. On this question, 37 ayes, 59 nays, less than the majority present having voted in the affirmative. Chair declares the amendment lost. Clerk will report the next amendment.
Delegate Hornbuckle moves to amend the amendment. This is HFA Hornbuckle 2-13.
Does the gentleman from the 16th wish to explain the amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, what my amendment does, we actually passed a bill back in 2017, Senate Bill 630, and it authorized virtual schools. This piece of legislation that we have in front of us is actually silent to that. So all my amendment does is to aim that we are not going to allow virtual charter schools. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As for the yeas and nays, I reserve the right to close.
Question before the House is the adoption of the amendment. Are the members who wish to speak to the adoption of the amendment? The gentleman from the 60th, Delegate Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think it's a terrible idea to take away that option. I have a daughter who graduated 2 years early from high school as a National Merit Scholarship finalist. She did her last 2 years of school simultaneously online while we lived in Europe because we were stationed there with the military. It'd be terrible if you took that option away from my other kids or any other kids who might be able to use them. Thank you, sir.
Are there other members who wish to speak to the adoption of the amendment? If not, the gentleman from the 16th to close debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have debated back and forth about these charter schools. We've come to the conclusion it's going to be 2 conversion schools, 2 conversion public charter schools, not virtual. Virtual charters take local taxpayer dollars and can potentially send them out of our state. Also, virtual charter schools perpetuate economic and social segregation. This is a fact. The Center for American Progress states that for-profit virtual schools graduate about half the students. Furthermore, for-profit cyber charters much lower graduation rates than nearby urban school districts that generally serve low-income students. We also know that in 2018, in the state of Ohio, that the ACOT, largest virtual K-12 school in Ohio, closed its doors after failing to repay $80 million in state funds. We're at a time where we're just getting some revenues back in the coffers. We can ill afford to send these dollars out. In 2017, the National Education Association's Charter School Task Force recommended that because of the combination of inherent limitations that pose to the healthy social and emotional development of students, along with their particularly dismal student outcomes, full-time virtual charter schools should not be authorized. Again, that is a charter school task force. I vote that we accept the amendment. Thank you.
The gentleman from the 16th has closed debate. For what purpose does the gentleman from the 18th, Delegate Worrell, seek to be recognized? The question before the House is the adoption of the amendment by the gentleman from the 16th. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed will say no. Noes have it. The amendment is rejected. Clerk will report the... Did the gentleman call a roll call?
Yes. Yes.
Chair did not hear the gentleman's demand. Is the demand sustained? Demand is sustained. Question before the House is the adoption of the amendment by the gentleman from the 16th. Those in favor will vote aye. Those opposed will vote no. The clerk will prepare the machine. Has every member voted? Has every member voted? If so, the clerk will close the machine and ascertain the result on this question. 56 ayes, 41 nays, 3 members absent not voting. More than a majority of those present having voted in the affirmative. Chair declares the amendment adopted. Clerk will report the next amendment.
Delegate Wilson moves to amend the amendment. This is HFA Wilson 2-13, number 10, revised.
Gentleman from the 60th, Delegate Wilson, to explain the amendment.
Thank you, sir. My intent with this amendment is to open up freedom to 5 communities to start charter schools. 5 communities throughout this state. At every turn tonight, we have subjected our children and our grandchildren to the iron grip of the existing power structure without any option for stepping outside of it, without any option for doing something different, for seeing something new, for going a little beyond. Not only our children and our grandchildren, but our educators. Now, I know that it seems that the educators, at least the ones we've seen here, are one solid voting block. They are not. I've heard from educators from across the state. They want some liberty. They want a chance to be able to do their job, to be creative, to be innovative.
This is it. 5 communities. Thank you, sir.
Question before the House is the adoption of the amendment by the gentleman from the 60th. Are the members who wish to speak to the amendment? Gentleman from the 21st, Doug Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the gentleman yield?
Gentleman does yield.
Could you explain the difference between this and the amendment we've already voted on that dealt with 5 charter schools? Is there a difference in the 2 amendments?
Yeah, actually, give me just a second. What's the number on it? 10.
Just wondering what the difference between this one is and the one the gentleman from the 66 explained earlier.
I believe that his required an IEP, didn't it?
Oh, I thought that was just for the ESAs.
I believe his required an IEP.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Mine does not.
Lady in the 48th, Doug Waxman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's a certain population we haven't talked about tonight that's affected by the opportunity to choose. And that's all the many teachers that were fantastic teachers that I run into in the grocery store, on the street. And I ask them how it's going at school, and they're not teaching anymore because they got sick and tired of not having the backup. We have too many people, fantastic teachers who are retiring early in a state that we're in desperate need of teachers. We have children trapped in this bureaucracy that with no way out. It's time that we vote for freedom of choice in this chamber. Please vote green this time.
Gentleman from the 62nd, Doug Bibby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to rise up again to talk for freedom and choice, and I've got read something from one of my constituents. Please pass the education bill so that the families of West Virginia will have a choice in their children's education. We're behind other countries of the world as a nation and rank very low compared to other states in our nation. So that tells me we need to do something different. I think the system we have now is more interested in maintaining control and perpetuating the system than working to improve the choices families have to educate their children. I believe competition is a good thing. It brings out the best in all and shines a light on competency. Change is not always easy, but not to change will guarantee the same results. We spend more than other countries per child, and yet we score lower on international testing. So I think we have to try something that has worked in other states, ESAs and charter schools. The people of West Virginia deserve a choice and the freedom to succeed, even if it creates a little noise while getting it accomplished. Please pass the education bill. And I want to echo this man's remarks. I speak for him, but he speaks for all of us. And I'll continue to voice their concerns, because that's the only time they get to get their concerns is in this chamber here by us. We have a responsibility to make sure those voices get heard, because they're not being heard and they're not being listened to. And like I said, I'll be here all night just to make sure that these people get heard and have a chance to have the freedom of choice for their child's education. Thank you.
The gentleman from 46, Doug Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just a point of inquiry. I think that the gentleman's explaining educational savings accounts. Is that correct?
I was explaining charter schools, but the individual had ESAs in there as well. The charter schools was included and was his concern.
Is the gentleman's question about the content of the amendment?
Well, I was just following up on the gentleman from Mingo. He had asked that how this was different from the amendment before, and he had said that there was not, that it required an IEP, and the amendment number 10 talks about charter schools, so I'm just trying to figure out. Oh, okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there other members who wish to speak to the adoption of the amendment? If not, does the gentleman wish to close debate? Question before the House is the adoption of the amendment. Roll call has been demanded. Is demand sustained? Demand is sustained. Question before the House is the adoption of the amendment. Those in favor will vote aye. Those opposed will vote no. The clerk will prepare the machine. Has every member voted? If so, the clerk will close the machine and ascertain the result. On this question, 33 ayes, 65 nays, 2 members absent not voting, less than a majority present having voted in the affirmative. Chair declares the amendment lost. Clerk will report the next amendment.
Delegate Wilson moves to amend the amendment. This is HFA Wilson 2-13, number 1.
Gentleman from the 60th, Delegate Wilson.
Yes, sir. So what we're looking at here is an opportunity to once again broaden our horizons, offer our kids and our grandkids a little bit of freedom, offer our teachers the opportunity to innovate through education savings accounts. Now, the thing is, I understand there's not much of a vision for education savings accounts based on the conversations we've had lately. But give me a second. Just let me lay it out for you. Imagine that you've got a Spanish teacher. You've got a Spanish teacher in your district. That Spanish teacher can either work at one school or that Spanish teacher can be available to everyone. Imagine that you've got a Spanish teacher who's in a different district. The point is that what you can do is you can use this ESA so that the teacher doesn't have to stay at one school, your kid doesn't have to go to that school. You can use this debit card if we use it that way, which would be a great way to do it, just like we do with the food programs that we have. And you can pay for whatever educational services your kids need. Now, the amount of money that's put on the card would be based on the amount of money that's currently used to determine, that's determined based on your kid's IEP, whatever program they're in. And they can use that money to pay for the educational services they need. This particular amendment opens ESAs up to the entire state, doesn't make it necessary, doesn't say everybody has to have one. It says it's an option. It's something that we can consider to help these kids who are out in areas where they can't get all the services they need, where they can't get the classes they want to take. If you got a kid who wants to study Chinese, this makes it an option for them. Please vote yes. Thank you, sir.
The question before the House is the adoption of the amendment. Are the members who wish to speak to the adoption of the amendment? If not, those in favor will say aye. Roll call has been demanded. Is the demand sustained? Demand is sustained. Question before the House is the adoption. The gentleman from 28th, Delegate Pack.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask for Rule 49 ruling, please.
As the gentleman has stated the factual situation to the chair, you are the parent of children enrolled in a private school. Therefore, you would be a member of a class of greater than 5 individuals and are therefore directed to vote. Question for the House is the adoption of the amendment as explained by the gentleman from the 60th. Those in favor will vote aye. Those opposed will vote no. Clerk will prepare the machine. Has every member voted? If so, the clerk will close the machine and ascertain the result. On this question, 26 ayes, 71 nays, 3 members absent not voting. Less than a majority of those present having voted in the affirmative. Chair declares the amendment lost. Clerk will report the next amendment.
Delegate Wilson moves to amend the amendment. This is HFA Wilson 2-13, number 2.
Gentleman from the 60th, Delegate Wilson.
Yes, sir. Give me just a moment to make sure we're on the right one here. Yes, sir. Basically the same amendment, but instead we're going to offer a little bit less freedom. Instead of any kid across the state, any kid anywhere in the state who needs these options, we're only going to offer it to 10,000. Now, how we're going to make that fair, based on the gentleman from the 36 discussion a while ago about how we would limit the number of kids had an option, I can't tell you. It's just a big round number. It's less than all of them. All of them would be liberty. All of them would be freedom. All of them would be honorable, would be right, would be just and fair. But since that's not what we're offering tonight, let's offer it to 10,000 of them. Thank you, sir.
Question before the House is the amendment as just explained by the gentleman from the 60th. Are the members who wish to speak to the amendment? Gentleman from the 1st, Delegate McGeehan.
Will the gentleman yield?
The gentleman does yield.
Can you please explain to me if you know in your amendment here, if all these people you're offering these ESAs to actually pay taxes?
No, I can't say that. As a matter of
Okay.
fact, it's an option. And actually, I would sincerely hope that this option would be available to people who can't necessarily afford to pay taxes. This is a public school option. Do we only allow people who can pay taxes to go to public schools?
No, hold on a second.
Yes, sir.
So you would agree then that this is a subsidy?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Just like public school. Thank you.
Are there other members who wish to speak to the adoption of the amendment? Does the gentleman wish to close debate? Roll call has been demanded. This demand is sustained. Demand is sustained. Question before the House is the adoption of the amendment. Those in favor will vote aye. Those opposed will vote no. Clerk will prepare the machine. Has every member voted? If so, the clerk will close the machine. On this question, there are 26 ayes, 73 nays, one member absent, not voting, less than a majority present. Having voted in the affirmative, Chair declares the amendment lost. Clerk will report the next amendment.
Delegate Wilson moves to amend the bill, moves to amend the amendment. This is HFA Wilson 2-13, number 3.
Gentleman to the 60th, Delegate Wilson.
Yes, sir. Let's offer those same opportunities to 5,000 children. 5,000 children. Can we do that? Just 5,000. 5,000 kids who are looking for something extra, something special, something more than what they've got right now. 5,000 kids who wouldn't have the option otherwise. I think we can do that. Thank you, sir.
Question before the House is the adoption of the amendment just explained by the gentleman from the 60th. Are the members who wish to speak to the amendment? Lady from the 36th, Douglas E. Step Burton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the gentleman yield?
Gentleman does yield.
We've talked often about the definition of insanity in this group. Would you define insanity for me, please?
Let's talk about the definition of determination. Let's talk about the definition of being absolutely dedicated to what the people of my district have sent me here to do. Let's talk about principles and honor and integrity.
We could talk about the 37 emails I've received against this here this evening, but thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from the 62nd, Douglas Bibby.
Thank you to my colleague at the District 60. No, I'm not insane, but I'm determined, and I'm going to continue to fight for the people to have a choice in their child's education. If 5,000 is too much for you, well, maybe Mr. Wilson has another he can offer. But we'll go here all night till we find a number. If it gets down to 0, I guess that's the way it's going to be, but we're going to find out, and we'll continue the fight. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from the 27th, Douglas Porterfield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just from what the delegate from the 28th brought up, my daughter is only 4, but we have already started homeschooling her. Does that mean I should not vote on these particular issues, or what would be your call on that? And I don't want to do anything to dishonor the House.
To the extent the gentleman has made a request pursuant to Rule 49, the gentleman, as he's described the factual situation, would be a member of a class larger than 5 individuals and therefore is directed to vote.
Thank you, sir.
Gentleman from the 15th, Douglas Foster.
Thank you. And I'm glad we brought up the issue of doing the same thing over and over, because our school system is currently failing our students in this state. We're ranked, in student achievement 49th? I mean, I may be incorrect, but maybe 48th now, not much of an improvement. But student achievement in the in the private school system, which is what this could be used for in the homeschool system, has been much better than our public school system. And I just don't understand why we should make it a matter of whether you can afford to or not to send your kid to a private school or homeschool. I don't understand why it's something where, well, you have that option. You have the ability to homeschool. You have the ability to send to private school, but only if you'll pay for it yourself, along with continuing to pay all your taxes to fund the public school system and everything else. That's what we're getting at here. At some point, you all have to say it makes sense to allow people to send their children to the school that they choose is best for their child. Just like we allow parents to make choices for their children as they see best fit. I don't see why we're ever going to sit here and keep saying no, no, no over and over to these parents that want to send their kid to a school that they feel best suits the needs of their child, just because they can't afford to. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I support the amendment.
Gentleman from the 44th, Delegate Hannah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Chances are I'm probably actually going to vote against the amendment, but just to address the comments from the gentlelady of Kanawha to the gentleman of the 60th on insanity, you know, we were sent here to do a job. And if it takes persistence to do that, then that's what we need to do. The woman from the 65th herself said that she was going to use the sexual orientation and gender identity and put it into every bill that she could. It's something she believes in. It's persistence. It's what we were supposed to do. It's why the people elected us and sent us to this House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman, 32nd, Delegate Fast.
Thank you. Would the sponsor yield?
Sponsor does yield.
Yes, sir. Thank you. So just want to be clear on education savings accounts. And let me see if I understand this correctly. A child lives in a community, and just through the geography, that child is supposed to go to a certain public school. And we know that to educate that child or attempt to educate that child in that school, it costs X amount of dollars. So if the parent recognizes that that school is a terrible fit for their child, then the parent can take that part of that X amount of dollars with the child, it follows the child to an alternative education setting. Am I correct on that?
That's the way I understand it, sir.
Okay. So these are just tax dollars that are following the child.
Tax dollars that were already committed to the child.
And so in this scenario, the system then, the whole education system, is not having to pay out more tax dollars because that child goes from school A to school B.
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you. Speak to the bill.
Gentleman may proceed.
The amendment to the amendment. Ladies and gentlemen, this isn't costing any more. It sounds to me like if we vote against this, we are simply afraid of allowing a child to go from one school to another school. The dollars are the same. It's not costing any more money. You talk about equality. Well-to-do parents can afford to pay the taxes to the public school system and send their child to an alternative education setting. The less fortunate are stuck. They have to send their child to the one school. Why? Because they can't afford to pay tuition at an alternative education setting. This amendment to the amendment allows those people to have a choice. It gives them a voice in the situation. If they realize their child is failing, the teachers are bad, or whatever, it's not a good fit. That's where a good parent comes in. But the poor parent who can't say, you know what, I'll just take my child and go to the right school, they're stuck. So my goodness, what is the fear here? I suggest we pass this amendment. I appreciate the gentleman's persistence, but I suggest we pass this amendment. It's not costing the system any more money. So I speak in favor of the amendment.
Gentleman 27, Doug Porterfield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd just like to direct to the lead sponsor of these amendments that I would not consider you at all insane. And I don't see where you've done the same thing. You've reduced the number. Every bill you've had has been different. And from what I understand from other colleagues of your manner of life, your service to this country, you're just doing what you believe's right. And I want you to know there's one guy over here that appreciates it. Thank you, sir.
Lady from the 48th, Doug Waxman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just think that we need to remind everybody what we're doing with every red vote against this. We have this bureaucracy that has great teachers, miserable, trapped, or retiring early. We have children trapped. We've heard the stories about the bullying, the abuse, the lack of learning. And then we look at the statistics on our school system. 51st in job readiness upon graduation. 51st. But yet, we can't let somebody who wants something a little bit better or something that works for their child out of this bureaucratic trap. We're 49th in SAT scores. Our bright light is the ACTs. We're 30th. That's something really to be proud of. Our kids are going to really compete out on the world stage with scores like that. But yet we can't give a kid, particularly a kid with little means, we want to keep them trapped in this bureaucratic system. If you're 9 years old, you don't have 5 or 10 years for the bureaucracy to figure out how to maybe fix the system. The system's broken. It's broken for teachers. It's broken for students. It's really time to give people some freedom. I sincerely hope at some point you decide to vote green on one of these freedom options. If you don't, I honestly don't know how you lay your head on the pillow at night, knowing the stories that we have been sent by children who need another option. Please vote green.
Gentleman with 62nd, Doug Bibby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague from the 62nd for talking about the cost savings that this ESA program does. The one thing we left out too, and when we had the Education Department in last week briefing the Education Committee, I asked about what happens to the federal dollars associated with that. Well, the answer to the federal dollars, they don't go with the child. Where do they go? They stay with the county school system. That's more money that's going to the county school system by having a child go take ESA. You're only taking 75% of the state aid, about $3,100, about what you're talking about a child getting. The schools are going to keep the other 25% and all of the federal dollars, because the federal dollars are associated with the set done by at each census and goes with the school system. So it's not about the cost. It's not about letting parents do what they want for their kids. It's really about control. It's control over the education of the children of this state. It's so hard that you cannot let control of the children of this state go, that you're willing to give up the federal dollars that are associated with this program, even though it'll provide more money into the school system that you could use to help other areas in the school. And all we're doing is giving a parent who chooses to do it. We're not demanding that they do it, or we're just giving them an option to do it. They may not even choose it. This is a no-brainer, people. I don't know how anyone can vote no on this. Thank you, and I'm supportive of the amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman with 60th, close debate. No. Question before the House is the adoption of the amendment. Roll call has been demanded. Is demand sustained? Demand is sustained. Question before the House is adoption of the amendment. Those in favor will vote aye. Those opposed will vote no. Clerk will prepare the machine. Has every member voted? If so, the clerk will close the machine and ascertain the result. On this question, 32 ayes, 67 nays, one member absent, not voting, less than the majority present having voted in the affirmative. Chair declares the amendment lost. Clerk will report the next amendment.
Delegate Wilson moves to amend the amendment. This is HFA Wilson 2-13, number 4.
Gentleman of the 60th, Delegate Wilson.
Mr. Clerk, I believe the one we're looking for is number 6. Number 4 doesn't have the next one's supposed to be for 5,000. I'm looking at number 4, it doesn't have 5,000 in there. Okay, my apologies, 2,500 then. But number 4 doesn't have that in there as well. Yeah.
What amendment does the gentleman wish to present?
I'm looking it up. Number 8, please. HFA Wilson 2-13-8, please. State. 25.
Are we at number 8?
Ask unanimous consent to withdraw number 4.
Is there objection? Chair hears no objection. Number 4 be withdrawn. Clerk will report the next amendment.
Delegate Wilson moves to amend the amendment. This is HFA Wilson 2-13, number 8.
Gentleman may proceed.
Thank you, sir. Would you allow that 2,500 IEP students in this state might be a little different, might not fit inside the little tiny box, might not fit inside the cookie cutter? 2,500 students on an IEP might merit a little bit of freedom. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question before the House is the adoption of the amendment. Gentleman of the 15th, Douglas Foster.
Well, gentleman from the 60th, yield.
Yes, sir.
I have a suggestion. We seem to be going down the road and people not interested in doing a changing the formula and trying to get this into this. But I have a suggestion for your amendment, and this is pending a unanimous consent to move this amendment to the foot of all amendments. But what I would like to do is see if you would be interested in reforming your amendment to do, instead of, because some of the concern is somebody may not be paying taxes that gets this amendment. Could we reform this amendment to be a tax credit as applied for somebody that falls under the stipulations of the 2,500 students and an IEP.
I would consider it to be a shame to have to do that, because the entire hope here is that people who can't afford to pay taxes would still be able to afford to have a great education. But if that's the only way that we can get the support we need, yes, sir, I would amend it.
Right.
I would reform it.
Thank you. And then also, can I ask unanimous consent that the amendment be placed at the foot of all amendments?
That there is a technical problem with the gentleman's request, because at the foot of all amendments is an amendment that will strike everything but the pay raise portion of the bill. So the amendment could be placed at the second to the foot of all amendments.
Second to the foot of all amendments.
All right, is there objection? Chair hears no objection. Clerk will report the next amendment.
Delegate Hamrick moves to amend the amendment. This is HFA Hamrick 2-13.
Gentleman from the 48th, Delegate Hamrick, wish to explain the secondary amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This amendment is pretty simple. It just clears up some language that was brought to our attention by HEPC. Basically, this would continue the funding for the students that are in the program, in the existing program. I think there was some ambiguity that whether or not there would be a funding mechanism for the students remaining in the program currently. In the Underwood-Smith, in the Underwood-Smith program.
Question for the House is the adoption of the amendment. Are the members who wish to speak to the adoption of the amendment? If not, those in favor of the amendment will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Clerk will report the next amendment.
Delegates R. Thompson, Hartman, Hornbuckle, Eastep Burton, Miley, and Doyle move to amend the amendment. This is HFA R. Thompson et al. 2-13.
Does the gentleman of the 19th, Delegate Thompson, wish to explain the amendment?
Yes.
Gentleman,
Yes.
proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a simple amendment. It's simply, the legislation as it's before us right now would make all central office administrators, supervisors, and directors who begin employment in new positions after July 1st, 2020, it would make them serve at the will and pleasure of the superintendent and the County Board of Education. In other words, they could be let go for any reason. My amendment simply strikes that out. It's on page 19 and 20. It's lines 22 through 25, begins with provided, and it simply strikes out the new language and returns it to the current status, which is essentially they can be let go given poor performance evaluation. So there has to be a reason currently for them to be let go, and this simply restores that language into the bill. Thank you. I urge adoption, and I ask for the ayes and nays.
Question for the House is the adoption of the amendment. Are the members who wish to speak to the adoption of the amendment? If not, the question for the House is the adoption of the amendment. The roll call has been demanded. Is the demand sustained? Demand is sustained. Those in favor of the amendment will vote aye. Those opposed will vote no. The clerk will prepare the machine. Has every member voted? If so, the clerk will close the machine and ascertain the result. On this question, 52 ayes, 45 nays, 3 members absent not voting. Majority of those present having voted in the affirmative. Chair declares the amendment adopted. Clerk will please report the next amendment.
Delegate Dean moves to amend the amendment. This is HFA Dean 2-13.
Does the gentleman from the 21st, Delegate Dean, wish to explain the amendment? Gentleman may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the Education Committee, I offered an amendment, and while the language of that amendment is what we adopted, the intent behind that amendment didn't come out as we meant. So working with council and some other members, the language would now say this. It's in the seniority section. Notwithstanding any provision of this code or county policy to the contrary, all reductions shall first be prioritized by employees with the highest certifications, and then the seniority of such employee, provided that the employee's last performance evaluation of this, as applicable, was not less than satisfactory. What the end result of this is if two employees are up to be riffed, and they have the same qualifications, but they have different levels of seniority, it still allows you to go with the person with less seniority only if the other one has an unsatisfactory evaluation. Seniority is important, but so is keeping quality educators around, so I urge support of this amendment.
The question before the House is the adoption of the amendment. Gentleman from the 15th, Douglas Foster.
I just have a question of the sponsor of the amendment.
Sponsor does yield.
And I'm just not familiar with it, knowing that you're a president in the school system or a principal in the school system. In these evaluations, what percentage are we talking about? Who has unsatisfactory? What's the issue here, as in how many have an unsatisfactory versus do not? Are we actually affecting a particular group of people or not?
Without speaking for all the other principals in the state, I could safely say that very few have unsatisfactory evaluations, and the reason is because there's not a whole lot of weight put on those. I think this would actually encourage more valid evaluations of our employees.
Are you saying that there's not much scrutiny put into your evaluations, or what are you saying?
That's pretty much what I'm saying. Because there's not a whole lot of weight behind the evaluations, there's not much you really do with those, there's not much emphasis put on those.
All right, thank you.
The gentleman from the 14th, Doug Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the sponsor yield? Wasn't this the way it came out of Education Committee anyway?
This was the meaning of what we voted on in Education Committee, but the actual wording that we ended up approving, there was some concern that it did not do this. The concern was that the language that we actually adopted, even though that was our intent, was that it would go from certification to a set of qualifications without the unsatisfactory evaluation. This was the intent of the amendment, and it's the way we kind of talked about it in committee, yes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, to speak to the amendment.
Gentleman may proceed.
I'd urge support. Thank you.
Gentleman from the 19th, Doug Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the Vice Chairman of Education making this amendment. It still provides accountability from the administrators in the school system, in the schools, and it also provides that level of protection there for the employees as well. So I urge adoption.
Gentleman from 32nd, Doug Fast.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Point of inquiry, does this amendment conflict with delegate from the 27th, the very first amendment that was moved to the foot?
It does not. The gentleman from the 27th has withdrawn that amendment and offered a reformed amendment which does not conflict.
Oh, didn't know that. Thank you.
The gentleman from the 16th, Doug Hornbuckle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the Vice Chair and the gentleman from the 67th willingness to rework this amendment and get the correct language. I urge adoption.
Question before the House is adoption of the amendment. Are there other members who wish to speak to the adoption of the amendment? Does the gentleman from the 21st wish to close debate? Question before the House is adoption of the amendment. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed will say no. Ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. Clerk will please report the next amendment.
Delegates Hornbuckle, Doyle, and R. Thompson move to amend the amendment. This is HFA, Hornbuckle, Doyle, and R. Thompson 2-13.
The gentleman from the 67th, Doug Doyle, to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This next amendment has a direct relationship to the amendment that we just adopted. The language that in the amendment we just adopted was written presuming the language in this amendment had been written differently. What we discovered when the gentleman from the 27th offered his amendment was that the wrong language had crept downstairs from the committee. So what this does is restores the language to the way it is in current code, which is that seniority is first. Initially, the proposal up in House Education had been to remove seniority entirely, and that was the language in there. If you will notice, there were at least a half a dozen places where the word seniority was struck and the word qualifications was inserted in lieu thereof. After we debated it for a while, we agreed on a compromise, which is the combination of restoring it back to seniority
and then the language articulated by the previous amendment, which modified that. So the two together make the compromise. I urge adoption of this amendment.
Question before the House is adoption of the amendment. Are there members who wish to speak to the adoption of the amendment? If not, the question before the House is the adoption of the amendment. Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no. No. Noes appear to have it. Roll call's been demanded. Is demand sustained? Demand is sustained. The question before the House is the adoption of the amendment. Those in favor will vote aye. Those opposed will vote no. Clerk will prepare the machine. Has every member voted? If so, the clerk will close the machine and ascertain the result. On this question, 48 ayes, 49 nays, 3 members absent not voting, less than a majority present having voted in the affirmative. Chair declares the amendment lost. Clerk will report the next amendment. This is the point on the calendar to which the amendment originally offered by the gentleman from the 27th, Delegate Schott, has been placed. Without objection, the original amendment will be withdrawn and replaced by a reformed amendment. Are there objections? Chair hears no objections. Gentleman from the 27th to explain the reformed amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm going to start again. I think we got bogged down with the last one, and let me just say that the amendment was offered at the suggestion of one of the groups that represents our professional educators, and I thought that it would be pretty smooth sailing, but apparently that message did not get conveyed to everyone. So, and we took a shortcut and basically incorporated that language within the entirety of the strike and insert of the Education Committee with respect to that provision. If you'll look at the reformed amendment, you'll see that we pulled out all that language and just focused on the intent of this amendment. And basically, this amendment does nothing more than change the timing of when the random drawing for seniority takes place. As I explained earlier, and this is mostly in the context, important in the context of a reduction in force, if a number of employees are scheduled to be reduced in force, the board has to look at certifications and seniority. And if you have employees that have the same seniority and the same certification, there is a randomized drawing that takes place at that point to determine the order of seniority. And of course, the one who ends up with the last place is reduced first. All this does is change when that drawing takes place. And as the example that I gave earlier, if you had 5 employees that were hired at the same time, at the same on the same agenda at the board meeting, and they all had the same certifications, then within 30 days of that date, there would be a randomized drawing, and the method of doing that would be determined by those employees with the approval of the board, and that would take place at that time, not at the time of the reduction in force. It seems to me a pretty simple concept, and it seems that it would eliminate a lot of uncertainty for those, in the example I gave, those 5 employees who, if they knew that there was likely to be a reduction in force, would then have some idea where they stood when that takes place, not at the last minute, and if necessary, could perhaps make other plans rather than being on pins and needles, so to speak, or twisting in the wind until the reduction in force occurred. I think it's a simple amendment. It doesn't cost a penny, and I think it would make the process a lot less agonizing for our professional educators. Mr. Speaker, I urge adoption.
Question for the House is adoption of the amendment as just described by the gentleman from the 27th. Are there members who wish to speak to the adoption of the amendment? If not, those in favor of the amendment will say aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Clerk will please report the next amendment. Is the gentleman from the 60th, Delegate Wilson, offering a reformed amendment?
Yes, sir. Dan's working on it right now.
House will be at ease for 6 minutes. We'll reconvene at 10:05. Gentleman 60th.
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Does the gentleman ask unanimous consent to reform the amendment?
Yes, sir.
Gentleman ask unanimous consent to reform the amendment. Are there objections? Chair hears no objections. Clerk will report the amendment.
Delegate Wilson moves to amend the amendment. This is HFA Wilson 2-13, number 8, reformed.
Gentleman from the 60th, Delegate Wilson, to explain the amendment.
Yes, sir. Basically, what we're offering here is instead of an education savings account would be an up to $3,000 tax credit on taxes owed for validated education expenses. In other words, the education expenses have to come from a list of verified education expenses and have to be validated, and it's only up to $3,000, and it is only against taxes owed. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question for the House is adoption of the amendment. Are there members who wish to speak to the adoption of the amendment? Gentleman from the 58th, Delegate Coles.
Mr. Speaker, my wife and I have our kids in private Christian school, and I'd ask for Rule 49 ruling.
Under the facts as presented by the gentleman, you would be a member of a class of much larger than 5 members and are therefore directed to vote. Gentleman from the 27th, Delegate Porterfield.
Same as before, Mr. Speaker. I do have a daughter that is homeschooled under Rule 49. I just want to make sure that that's spoken to the House.
Same situation, same ruling. Gentleman should vote.
Thank you.
Gentleman from the 29th, Delegate Steele.
Rule 49. I ask for permission under Rule 49 not to vote because I have a child in private school.
Same factual situation. Therefore, the chair's ruling is the same. Gentleman is directed to vote. Gentleman from the 67th, Delegate Doyle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think we should reject this amendment. Now, we've been here all night hearing about innovation and change and new ideas and all that. Folks, tax credits is a concept that we've tried many times in the history of this state, and they've hardly ever worked. So I don't think we should try them now. Let's vote this down.
The gentleman from the 28th, Delegate Pack.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was just asking for the continuation of the Rule 49 for this vote.
Same factual situation. Ruling of the chair is the same. Gentleman's directed to vote. Gentleman from the 35th, Delegate Capito.
Same ruling, please, Mr. Speaker.
Same request. Gentleman should vote. Gentleman from 36th, Delegate Rowe.
I was going to inquire about the amendment.
Of the sponsor?
Of the sponsor.
Does the gentleman yield? Gentleman does
Sir.
yield.
Hi, I'm reading the amendment, and as I understand it, this would allow folks who have children in private schools to have a tax credit, but only them. In other words, the same expenses would not apply for anybody who's in public school.
I'm sorry, sir. I can't understand anything you're saying.
As I understand the amendment and reading it just moments ago, it says that the parents of students who are in non-public schools can declare expenses for transportation costs, curriculum, textbooks, lab supplies, educational technology, tutoring, and so on. They can get a tax deduction of up to
$3,000.
How much is it?
$3,000.
$3,000. Now, is that a deduction or a credit?
It's a tax credit against taxes owed.
And that would not be available to any parent who had children in public school.
It would not be available to parents who are receiving services under the public school system.
Even though they're not getting, okay. So it only applies to private schools.
It only applies to people who are not availing themselves of the services provided in public schools.
Okay, thank you.
The gentleman from the 30th, Delegate Bates.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the Chairman of Finance yield?
Yes.
Thank you. I was trying to determine what impact this would have on revenues.
I don't think it matters at this point.
Well, I wasn't quite sure where to go from here. Do we have any idea how many? Do we have any idea how many students are in private education or homeschooling, or could potentially, how many families, how many taxpayers could potentially take advantage of this credit?
I'd like to offer some help, but I just don't know the answer. So,
perhaps the sponsor could answer that question. Thank you, sir.
Sir, I don't have a number for you, but I will tell you that ESAs would have left money in the public schools, without the students taking services from the public schools. Well, we voted those down. That kind of freedom is not available to the people of West Virginia. This is the next best level. People can get the education they need, get the services for their kids, and get a little bit of a break, and it's nowhere near the amount that's being spent on them in public schools.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you,
Mr.
sir.
Speaker.
The gentleman from the 40th, Delegate Jeffries.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to request Rule 49.
Same factual situation.
Yes, sir.
The chair's ruling would be the same. The gentleman's directed to vote. The gentleman from the 62nd, Delegate Bibby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the gentleman yield from for the sponsor?
Sir.
Non-public school, would that, I assume that would also include homeschoolers?
I'm sorry, sir, I can't understand what you're saying.
Would that also include homeschool?
I believe that it would, yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you. If I speak to the amendment, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman may proceed.
I support this amendment. I think it's a good compromise. We don't want to be using tax dollars, I guess, or give away tax dollars. I think that was the saying that goes. But we're willing now to give a tax credit to homeschoolers and private schoolers who are not availing themselves of the public school system. We're just a return of their dollars so they can make a good investment. I support the gentleman's amendment and urge passage.
The gentleman from the 60th, Delegate Wilson, to close debate. Question before the House is the adoption of the amendment by the gentleman from the 60th. Roll call has been demanded. Is the demand sustained? Demand is sustained. Those in favor of the amendment will vote aye. Those opposed will vote no. The clerk will prepare the machine. Has every member voted? If so, the clerk will close the machine and ascertain the result. On this question, 49 ayes, 50 nays, one member absent, not voting, less than a majority of those present having voted in the affirmative. Chair declares the amendment lost. Clerk will report the next amendment.
Delegates Longstreth, Bates, Hornbuckle, Rowe, Doyle, and Miley move to amend the amendment. This is HFA Longstreth, Bates, Hornbuckle, and Rowe, Doyle 2-13.
Two sponsors have indicated recognition to explain the amendment. Which sponsor would like to explain the amendment? Gentleman from the 30th, Delegate Bates.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Considering the nature of what's transpired here over the last 11 hours, I ask unanimous consent to withdraw the amendment.
Okay, gentleman from the 30th, ask unanimous consent that the amendment be withdrawn. Is there objection? Chair hears no objection. The amendment is withdrawn. Clerk will report the next amendment. Are there further secondary amendments? If not, the question before the House now is the primary amendment as amended. Is there discussion on the primary amendment as amended? If not, those in the gentleman from the 32nd, Delegate Fast.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would ask the chairman of education or someone to now explain what's left. Or perhaps the speaker.
Chair is not in a position to do that. Gentleman from the 48th, Delegate Hamrick.
I'm not 100% sure I'm in a position to do that either, but I'll try my best. All right. So 11.8.6F, the part regarding the levy rate increase is at the general election. The other language remains the same. 11.21.25, the tax credit, $250 tax credit for teachers and service personnel remains the same as it was presented originally. The open enrollment policy remains the same. The counselors, 80% instead of 75% remains the same. Making the administrators at will has been removed from the bill. Primary recommendation of a teacher being the primary consideration of a student being promoted is the same. The section regarding magnet schools being included under innovation zones remains in the bill. The $5 million to the innovation zone line item appropriation remains. The charter school language as it came out of education with the 2 conversion elementary public charter schools remains the same. $18.84, which is the language that was the same as HB 2620 that the House already passed regarding reporting requirements to contact the parents regarding unexcused absences remains the same. 18.9A2, the increased funding for step 5 in the formula and including social workers and psychologists in the definition of professional support personnel remains in the bill. The minimum enrollment of 1,400 students remains. 18.9A8, professional support personnel line item for 4.7 remains as well. We added the law enforcement, 1 law enforcement per school. Yeah, using federal funds allocated first. The formula allowance for current expenses from 70.25 to 71.25 for cost and operations and maintenance remains the same. Okay, 18.9A12 was replaced with language sending the growth and local share back to the counties that generate it, but also continuing to fund step 7. 18A4-2, the 5% pay increase, and the differential pay, the 3 additional years of experience for math instructors spending at least 60% of their time remains the same. One-time $2,000 payment for classroom teachers who complete the Department of Education specialized mathematics course remains the same. 18A4-5, removing the no less than 10% difference in salary provisions remains the same. $18A4-5, allowing counties to provide additional compensation for fully certified teachers that are assigned in critical need and shortage areas has remained the same. Yeah. 18A47A was amended to use seniority unless there is a unsatisfactory evaluation. Then the other qualifications contemplated in the bill would be considered as well. Page. 5% pay raise for service personnel remains the same. Yeah, the leave portion of the bill, giving half at the beginning of the year and half at the end of the year stay the same. Just bear with me just 1 second. Okay, and then just getting clarification, the end of year bonus did get amended up to $1,000. 18C41 through 5, the Underwood Smith Teaching Scholar Program remains the same except for the amendment by Delegate Storch, including music, and the amendment that I offered that just clarified the language that the students remaining in the program currently would continue to be funded. And the language regarding BRIM coverage notifications will be given yearly to employees remains the same. So that's the explanation of how the bill remains, or the strike and insert amendment.
The gentleman, the 16th, Doggett Linville.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to give a little more detailed explanation as to where we are right now. To the delegates who represent Barber County, $854,391 more dollars. To the delegates who represent Berkeley County, $9,822,124. To the delegates who represent Boone, $1,371,973. Braxton, $1.332 million. Brooke, 1.429, Cabell, 5.429, Calhoun, 2.514. Clay, I'll just refer you to this sheet in front of you. More than $100 million, $134 million. Next, I'd like to point out that a significant amount of that money is for 400 new mental health care workers, professionals in our schools to address the opioid crisis. Next, I'll point you to the fact that the gentleman from the 55th, as he sponsored his amendment, $40 million more dollars and a police officer in every school. As he mentioned, you know what, folks, there's a lot of issues with this bill. There's things I don't like. I had an amendment reconsidered and failed on the second time. But you've got to ask yourself, when we look at this, does the good outweigh the bad? $134 million more dollars to all of our counties. A police officer in every school, and to paraphrase what the gentleman was saying when we dealt with that particular amendment, folks, we're talking about what would you do if there was, in fact, a school shooting in the state of West Virginia and you chose not to provide that funding? And you had the opportunity right here, right now. There are consequences of every decision that we make. And if that, only that, were one that we could prevent, one that we could stop, a child's life that we could save. He asked, how there's all sorts of questions about how much that this would actually cost. The question is, how much is the cost of a life of a child? Folks, there's things that those of us don't like, and there's things that some of us do like, and many of them it's different for each of us. But for all those reasons, I would urge passage.
Question for the House is adoption of the strike and insert amendment, which, if adopted, will become the bill. Are there other members who wish to speak to the adoption of the strike and insert amendment? The gentleman from the 48th, Doggett Hamrick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Am I recognized to close on the amendment?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We spent quite a lot of time on this amendment. We spent 3 long days of questions in the Education Committee, a couple days in the Finance Committee, and I think almost 12 hours here on the floor today discussing the strike and insert amendment. So, at this point, I think we have, have the definition before us of letting something go through the process. So at this point, I would urge passage of the amendment and look forward to seeing where we go from here.
Gentleman's closed debate. Gentleman from the 58th, Doggett Coles.
Point of inquiry, if I could, Mr. Speaker.
State your inquiry.
Mr. Speaker, the question before us is a full strike and insert that would become the bill. If it were to fail, we would return back to the original Senate bill as it came across?
Gentleman is correct.
Thank you.
Gentleman is correct. Roll call's been demanded. Is the demand sustained? Is the demand sustained? Demand is sustained. The question for the House is the adoption of the strike and insert amendment as worked on for 11 and a half hours and just explained by the gentleman from the 48th. Those in favor will vote aye. Those opposed will vote no. The clerk will prepare the machine. Has every member voted? Has every member voted? If so, the clerk will close the machine and ascertain the result. On this question, there are 63 ayes, 37. The clerk will close the machine. On this question, there are 61 ayes, 38 nays, 1 member absent not voting. Majority of those present having voted in the affirmative, chair declares the amendment adopted. Bill will be advanced. Further bills on second reading. Leaves of absence. Lady from the 49th.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For our colleague, Delegate Kump.
Are there objections? If there is no objection, leaves will be granted. Chair hears no objection. Remarks by members of the House, introduction to guests, miscellaneous business. Lady from the 49th.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move subject to announcements that the House adjourn until 11 a.m. Thursday, February 14th.
Lady in the 49th moves that subject to announcements. The House stand adjourned until 11 a.m. tomorrow, Thursday, February 14th. Are there announcements? Gentleman
Yes.
from the 15th, Delegate Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to announce tomorrow at 4:30, the subcommittee on House Bill 2864, which is the judicial pay bill. We're going to have a meeting at 4:30 in the Judiciary Room, and the individuals on that subcommittee are myself, Delegate Byrd, Delegate Lovejoy, Delegate Steele, and Delegate Mant. And again, that is at 4:30 in the House Judiciary Committee Room, and we will consider that after the meeting on the substance abuse. Sorry. Thank you.
Lady in the 49th, Delegate Summers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Your Rules Committee will meet tomorrow morning at 10:45 behind the chamber.
Gentleman from the 27th, Delegate Schott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Committee on Judiciary will not reconvene tonight. We will have a regular meeting at 9 o'clock on Friday where we will pick up where we left off today, and the agenda will be posted.
Gentleman from the 41st, Delegate Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Your Committee on Health and Human Resources will meet tentatively at 2 p.m. tomorrow in 215E. The agenda will be posted on the automation system. Republicans will caucus 30 minutes prior to the meeting.
Gentleman from the 10th, Delegate Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Your Committee on Energy will meet tomorrow at 2 p.m. in the Judiciary Conference Room. The agenda will be posted. Republican members will meet in the chairman's office at 1:30.
Gentleman from the 35th, Delegate Nelson.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Your Committee on Banking and Insurance shall meet tomorrow at 10 a.m. in the GovOrg 215 room. The agenda has been posted. Thank you.
Lady from the 3rd, Delegate Storch.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Your Committee on Political Subdivisions will meet tomorrow at 4 p.m. in House Education. The agenda is posted.
Gentleman from the 48th, Delegate Queen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Committee on Small Business, Economic Development, and Entrepreneurship will meet at 9 a.m. in the morning in GovOrg. Agenda will be posted.
Gentleman from the 1st, Delegate McGeehan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Your Committee on Veterans Affairs and Homeland Security will not meet tonight. It will meet tomorrow instead at 5:30 in House Education. The agenda will be posted.
Gentleman from the 9th, Delegate Holland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Your Committee on Prevention and Treatment of Substance Abuse will meet tomorrow at 3:30 in room 215E. The agenda is posted.
Gentleman from the 48th, Delegate Hamrick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Your Committee on Education will not be meeting tonight or tomorrow as originally planned at 3:30 a.m. We will be meeting at 9 a.m. on Friday.
In the committee conference room, we suppose. Gentleman from the 17th, Delegate Rohrbach.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Your Committee on Seniors, Children's, and Family Issue will meet tomorrow at 1 p.m. in the Government Organization Room. Thank you.
Are there further announcements? If not, the question before the House is a motion by the lady from the 49th that the House stand adjourned until 11 a.m. tomorrow, Thursday, February 14th. Those in favor will say aye. Ayes have it. The House is adjourned to 11 a.m. tomorrow.